Well, we are talking about the coming of the Holy Spirit. Three great things in Christianity: the birth of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and the Holy Spirit being given to us, put upon us. It's Acts 2, verses 1 through 21. And this is out of the ESV, which is what you have in your pew. Excuse me. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galilean? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretians and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others, mocking them, said, "They are filled with new wine." So then we have Peter's sermon explaining it, sort of. Peter's standing there with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them. "Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give ear to my words. For these people are not drunk as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire, vapor and smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." Sweet, sweet Spirit. On Pentecost, the Holy Spirit translated the proclamation, but Peter interpreted. I have a question for you. What has 27 moving parts and speaks in 30 tongues? I also have the answer: the European Union. Now that the United Kingdom has exited, the European Union includes 27 countries. That means there are some 477 million people living under the collective government of the EU, and that puts the EU on a field to rival the United States in political and economic clout, which of course was the initial purpose of the EU. And it's a good thing, to be sure, but those 30 tongues get in the way of being more accomplished. Unlike the United States, which, despite whatever fracture lines it may have, it's still one country. The European Union is not. but a federation of nations. It seems to speak with one voice without surrendering any one of the uniqueness of the individual nations, but we see as the British backed out, sometimes they get a little hacked off with the voice they're using, telling them who's going to populate their country, as an example. And to avoid any one of these problems, the EU operates in 25 official languages. There are 27 countries with 25 official languages. And some countries have additional languages that aren't official, such as Spain. Spain has 5 languages. 3 of them are official. And they want the other 2 to become official also. And so you can see what kind of turmoil this creates. It's bound to create more confusion than a banana in a barrel of monkeys. I mean, it's just wild. Really, it's a significant complication that they're able to complete what they needed to complete. It means that every session of the EU Parliament now needs to have 65 trilingual interpreters on hand before they start. And for another thing, it means that each member nation, has a right to require any EU document to be translated into its native tongue. And those translation services run the EU a little over $2 billion a year. Can you imagine that? And when you consider all these language groups and the communication hurdles they represent, it's remarkable that the EU has accomplished what they have. And likewise, when you consider all the language groups and the communication hurdles that were present in Jerusalem on that day of Pentecost 2,000 years ago, it is remarkable that enough about Jesus got through to the crowd, that 3,000 people accepted Christianity. Can you imagine that? 3,000 people accepted Christianity on that day. You think the Holy Spirit wasn't at work? Wow. The reading from Acts sounds like it could be a roll call in a plenary session of the EU. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, and Cretians and Arabs. That means there were 256 possible 2-language combinations. And there were no trilingual translators prepared, if there even were any, except the Holy Spirit. The wonder of it all rumbled through the crowd. Not all of those are speaking Galileans, they asked. Yeah, they were. They were all from Galilee. And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? So the first public miracle at Pentecost was instant translation. Translation alone was not sufficient, the text tells us. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" I worked with a fellow from Italy. He'd studied to be a priest, as a matter of fact. And he would say to me, "But Roger, what does all of this mean?" when we were discussing Bible stuff. And you know, you can really, when you read the Bible, sometimes it gets that way. But what does all of this mean? The Holy Spirit has to open your head up to receive it, to understand it. And there they were. What does all of this mean? So the miracle of translating the words from the Galilean tongue into the polyglot spoken by the hearers enabled the crowd to comprehend the words that the disciples were saying, but not to really discern what those words meant. The EU discovered this same problem. That's why they search for language specialists who can not only translate words, but also can interpret their meaning. A translator can go from a word in one language to a word in another. But an interpreter also knows the cultures of the two language groups and can recognize when the literal translation does not express the intended meaning in the destination language. I'll give you a simple explanation, and I've used this before. King James, Middle English it's called. In my Father's house are many mansions. What does that mean? To us, a mansion is a great big place, a palatial kind of house where really rich people live. But back in Middle English, it didn't mean that. It meant a dwelling place. Could have been living in your father's basement or whatever. So you can see that there's more than to translating. You can translate it into mansion, which would be really the proper translation. But the true meaning of it is it's where you live. And this is where we get into problems with translations and transliterations. Are we translating word for word? Or are we translating meaning for meaning? And it's kind of nice, really, to have a Bible that does both and tells you when it's doing what. Or you have a whole bunch of Bibles and you look up a whole bunch of stuff and you're trying to determine, okay, this is the translation, but what is the meaning? It's an interpreter who reviews material translated from a Greek source that says tobacco has to be stopped, knows that someone mistranslated it in the EU because Greeks don't want tobacco to stop, they smoke. Sort of like the mansion thing. So we got this going on all the time. Words translate, but that's not really what it quite means. And what about in today's language around here? Oh my goodness. Some of you are old enough, like me, to have traveled in the South when it was the old South, before air conditioning. And that's where Southerners lived. And they didn't talk like Yankees. I recall I had a truck driver lived in Mississippi. I guess it was back in the early 60s. I called down there to ask John to do something. And the lady answered the phone. I said, could I talk to John? And I understood he wasn't there. And several hours later, the phone rang, and he said, hey, Roger, this is John. He said, did you call? I said, yeah. He said, well, my mother-in-law was babysitting, and she said a Yankee called. She couldn't understand a word he said. So you understand, I mean, there's, not only is it a translation, we're both speaking English, but there's all kinds of things that go into effect here. During World War II, the Navajo code talkers, there were only about 30 whites that could speak Navajo the way Navajos spoke it. It's a guttural language. And the sounds and the unks and the ugs in it have meaning. And so they were fantastic code talkers, used in the Pacific primarily, because when the Japanese tapped in to listen to American messages, if Navajos were passing on the message, they didn't have a clue. It's fabulous. And on that first Christian Pentecost, Peter was the interpreter who answered the crowd's question about the meaning of the translation. They heard the translation, but hey, Peter, what's this all about? Are these guys drunk? And people told Jesus about, Peter told told people about salvation. In other words, the communication miracle of Pentecost happened because the Holy Spirit translated and Peter interpreted. Has it ever occurred to you that both translation and interpretation are still necessary to spread Christianity? If you work where I did, or do, sometimes, used to, I guess I still work there. I haven't been there in 10 weeks, but I still work there. We got a lot of young men that are in lockdown, virtually no education, so many of them. And they don't really understand what the Bible is saying. And you could see it. Some guys just want to soak it up like a sponge. Mr. Roger, tell us, what does this mean? And I just love sitting on the edge of their bed at night, trying to explain something to them, because you can see their eyes and see their spirits as they absorb what the Holy Spirit has to say. And then the really tremendous thing is, some of them will catch on fire. And when they catch on fire, then they can tell their peers. And their peers would much rather hear them than me, because their peers are part of them. And I'm a different person. I'm an outsider. I'm a quote-unquote cop. But they just want to soak this up, and they can read it and don't have a clue what it says. They can hear it and don't have a clue what it says. But when you sit there and explain it to them, they know. And that's our job, folks. That's our job. Explaining it. We need to all be Peters. We need to all be out there helping someone to understand. Has it ever occurred to you that translation is the work of putting faith into plain language? Just plain language. There are people who tell you, well, that's a bad translation. Yeah, it might be a lousy translation. But if it's telling the truth, it might be a good document to use if someone can understand it. We don't always need to translate word for word. We need to understand what the scriptures are saying. What does the text say? What does the text mean? What does it say to your heart? What does it say to the person you're talking to about it? We need to explain what the Christian story is. And often, more often than not, the Holy Spirit is really involved in that. And that's the greatest feeling in the world. Excuse me. When you're trying, when you're trying to explain something to somebody and you don't have the words for it and you don't know what to say, and you open your mouth and you suddenly hear the Holy Spirit explaining it coming out of your mouth. Oh boy, what a wow feeling. Gives you goosebumps. And the Lord will use you like that day after day, year after year. Just open yourself to Him. Allow yourself to be used. Don't be frightened about talking about God. We sometimes get uptight about talking about God. And we get uptight because we think we're going to make a mistake, or we're going to say the wrong thing, or how am I going to tell this person? You don't want to be ashamed. You don't want to make yourself a fool. You have to get that behind you. You have to let the Holy Spirit take over. This doesn't demand that you're especially eloquent or have a convincing speech ready. Doesn't mean you have a degree in Christian apologetics or narrative evangelism. But it does mean you are willing, when you are asked, to speak about your own experience of Christ. Ask John about his experience with Christ. Better pull up a chair. Ask me about my experience with Christ. Better pull up a chair. It should be that way with you. Pull up a chair, people. Here we go. What is your experience with Christ? How has Christ helped you? It's the little things that make all the difference in the world. The little things that fill us with joy. The little things. For example, some things that make a difference. I can no longer be comfortable with my prejudices. Are you prejudiced? Probably. I don't know what about, but probably. I am about things. We were watching a TV show the other night, and I said to my wife, I don't want to watch that. And I said, no, that's just my prejudices. We all have to deal with what we really are. We have to realize it. I have a real place that stays with me even when everything is going wrong. Do you have that? I am less judgmental and more able to forgive. Does that define you? I never knew a time when I was not a Christian, but I'm convinced it enlarges my spirit. You could go somewhere with that, couldn't you? I know joy and contentment in my life I never knew before. Well, there's a good trip to take. My natural inclination is to think only of myself, but because of Christ, I can no longer ignore the needs of others. The guilt I lived with has been taken away. It has put a song in my heart. I cannot sin in peace. That's interesting, isn't it? I cannot sin in peace. You ever caught yourself in a sin? Make you unhappy? I cannot sin in peace. Christ has given my life a purpose. There's a lot we can say. None of this interpreting guarantees the conversion of those who hear it. But statements about what commitment to Christ means to you personally has a greater impact than the best written Sunday school book or the most articulate sermon. That's because nobody can deny your personal experience. Realistically, all they can do is say that they never had a similar one. Or as I had a young fellow say to me one time, he said to me he'd murdered someone. He was a young guy. And he was in Teen Challenge. And we supported Teen Challenge, and many churches support him in the church we went to. And we had a dinner for him, and this young black kid sat down next to me, probably 17, 18 years old. And he said, and he'd given his testimony during church about how he murdered this guy and how the Lord took over his life, et cetera, et cetera. He said, what's your testimony, brother? I said, I really don't have one. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I grew up with my mother sitting on the foot of the bed, praying with me every night. I've never not known there wasn't Jesus Christ. I've never not known there wasn't God. And I really don't know who I'm more afraid of, God or my mother, you know. I mean, just one of those situations when you're raised in it. And he said to me, wow, that is really great. I said, what do you mean? He said, now I know I can raise a family that way. So you don't know. You don't know where it's going to take somebody. In the 19th century, British biologist Thomas Huxley, you've probably heard of him, was widely known for his brilliance in scientific writings, but also for his agnosticism. He was Mr. Agnostic. That's all there was to it. And toward the end of his life, he attended a house party at a country estate, one of these weekend affairs. And when Sunday came, most of the other guests were preparing to go to church, but not Huxley. And perhaps only because he wanted some company, he approached another guest, a man he'd known for his simple and solid Christian faith. And Huxley proposed that instead of going to church, that this man stay home with him and explain why he was a Christian. And the man protested. He said, "But you could demolish my argument in an instant. I'm not clever enough to argue with you. I'm not going to do that." Huxley assured the man he had no intention of arguing. He wanted to listen. He wanted to hear in simple terms what this man's faith had to say to him. When the man finished, Huxley said, "I would give my right hand if only I could believe that." Now, that's a story from a long time back, but it is still representative of many people today who have the same hunger for the meaning of peace and hope and joy and love. And at least for some of them, an interpreter of the faith like you can make the difference. You and I can make a big difference in someone's life. And often, we don't even know about it. But all we have to do is wait for heaven to come down. And that's our last hymn, and that's on page 510.